This discussion is about wargaming, its origins, and everything that could potentially be discussed about this interesting hobby. So we'll begin with, since the beginning, talking about the origins of anything that resembles an abstract representation of a conflict. There's nothing that can tell us when was the first war game created, or the games of war have been, if we go back in time, have been around since the inception. If we think about and we pinpoint the first time that a map was put into a table and rules were invented for such a map, and then added additional little figurines, of course we can go back into the time of the after the Napoleonic times, when these things are going to start being more um, normal. And then we have the Victorian era, in which the first Kriegspiel is going to be created. But we're going to talk about that later. We begin with small, important, abstract representations of a conflict that we have nowadays, and perhaps in some way or another, as an as a aficionado, you would, in some point of your life, would have contact with, for example, the chess game or the Go game, Japanese Go game. And there's the Sun Tzu one that is listed in the book of the Art of Wargaming by Peter Perla, the the so-called Wei Hai, the encirclement. That's the translation of that small little game. But it is said here that the Wei Hai was the original version, and then the Japanese created the Go, and everything was kept within the Sun Tzu's philosophy that will be used in this type of primitive war game. We can see that the influence of Sun Tzu is very powerful in that regard. We have seen that, and I remember when I first had the experience of interacting with the digital version of Total War, Total War Shogun, that feeling of using the Sun Tzu's philosophy was pretty palpable. Well, further we have, and we can move to India when we see the appearance of a chaturanga. Chaturanga is a more detailed type of war game. Chaturanga now has a real board. The board has small pieces craved and crafted for the actual representation. And it is a very, very interesting how this primitive small war game has soldiers, chariots, elephants, cavalry, everything that can be related as the order of battle of that time. There are a lot of fixed rules, and also there is the addition of dice rolls that would create unduplicable outcomes as far as that time. So that is something interesting. So yeah, and then we have chess, and we have that evidently chess will grow in popularity. It would be more easy to understand than chaturanga. Chaturanga was something that at first was a 4-player, and it was reduced to 2 players. From that, it will become further in time chess. Chess is a very stylized board with small figurines that are more abstract than chaturanga. And you would see intricate details that are present in chaturanga. However, we understand that the abstraction of chess, for example, and even the Indian version of chess, which is more complex that we are discussing here, they have within them at least the most basic principles of military thinking. The strategical thinking is represented here in a very basic way. But at this point, we already see that we are dealing here with the interaction of two sides that are making decisions constantly, and those decisions are affecting whatever pieces they have in front of them. So the pieces are the means for those decisions to be figured out at the end between two brains. And that is exactly the magic about this, the interaction of those principles of strategical thinking in between two human beings. And even in at this point in time, we see that eventually you would have a lot of it would be demonstrated, and even in ancient terms and the concepts of the ancient commanders, very clear that it's just a representation. So here is where the things should be cleared, because even at this point, to command little pieces on a board is not even close to at least having thousands of men at your command, even in ancient times, as I was implying here. So, what is all about these skills that are central to military thinking and strategical thinking? Those are, I'm going to quote Peter Perlas in his book for the origins of Wargame here, quote, the chess-like games require the players to focus on a well-defined objective and to evaluate the abilities of their own and their opponent's forces. They must analyze the strengths and weaknesses of various dispositions and devise strategies and tactics to overcome the enemy's strength and compensate for their own weaknesses and thus achieve the objective. End quote. At this point, we have to understand that chess would be and would remain, in effect, a very important tool for strategical thinking and understanding of certain concepts of warfare, but not a tool to be used for more finer points in the art of war. It's not a tool that can be used in actual warfare. At this point, we're going to see the King's Game, the Königsspiel, which is going to be invented by a, a German called Christopher Weichmann, that he's going to try to create more than an abstract game, but a tool. And this is going to get a lot of military details into it. So I'm going to quote again here Peter Sperla. Weichmann's game was based on chess, but employed a large board and provided each of its players with 30 pieces. Like chess, each of the pieces was named for a character common in political and military world of its time. There was the inevitable king, it was added the marshal, colonel, captain, and various numbers of lieutenants, chancellors, heralds, knights, adjutants, bodyguards, halberdiers, and private soldiers. As in chess, each of the pieces had its own peculiar movement capabilities. End quote. In those times, these men that created this new type of chess, which were actually dubbed as war chess, military chess. The Kuningspiel was basically a more fancified version and overcomplicated version of chess, evidently, but despite this, Weidmann would claim that it was designed not only to be a pastime but to use as a military tool. It is very unlikely that this was basically a fact. So the military professionals believed that that was exactly an abstract representation of reality, and that wouldn't be possible to use this tool as something serious. Now, at this point, we should discuss about the game introduced in 1780 by another German Dr. C. L. Hellwig, which was pretty much the Duke of Brunswick's. He was the Duke of Brunswick's master of pages, and he introduced three concepts that are going to be for the wargaming something very important. He would use the concept of aggregation, which is employing a single piece to represent a more larger body, or what is nowadays a counter that represents, for example, a company or a battalion, or a card in Total War Game that represents basically a regiment of or a company. So basically, he started to implement as as early as 1780 the concept of aggregation, and also replaced the abstract board game, which has bicolored chessboards, with multicolor that would start representing each different color, different types of terrain. You would also employ an umpire, which is a supervisor that would act as a referee to supervise the rules of the game. So basically, we're talking here about a very entertaining and educational tool that mostly is going to be used by the nobility or people from the nobility that would like to get themselves the concepts of warfare. It was an very innovative situation, retain a lot of the basic things about chess. I'm going to quoting here Peter Sperla's book, quote, "The playing surface was larger than a chessboard containing 1,600 spaces, but the spaces were still basically the squares of the chessboard. Red squares were mountains, blue squares were lakes or rivers, light green squares represented marshes, and dark green squares symbolized forests. Black and white squares were open terrain, and buildings were depicted by half red squares." End quote. At this point, we see that there's an array of different types of terrain represented here. We have symbolization of forests, and obviously mountains. High terrain would be something about these marshes, because we can add a little bit of the concept of moving slowly, the participation of two players, and the representation of the actual figurines were the same as the chess pieces. There were not as few as the pieces that you find in chess, but here we're talking about 120 pieces. So something around that. Infantry battalions, light and heavy cavalry squadrons, artillery, and pontoons and pontooniers, engineers were also implemented. So this is something huge, because this is a game changer in the fact that you are representing also in here fortifications and entrenchments. So basically you have a very, very huge table with small pieces of chess representing a huge battlefield. And there was also a separation opposing sides at the starts. So we have also deployment zones implemented in this regard. this type of war chess, of chess of war, was a evident success, and it was used quite a lot in France, Austria, and Italy. And in the next half century, it would spawn a number of imitators and many variations. So it is said that war chess resembled a an imitation of the conflict, but it was still considered as having the same relationship that, for example, the game of Monopoly has vis-a-vis the business games.